that would have been retirees in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. High tax receipts plus few dependents equals excellent government finances. But this golden age of high tax receipts and low government payouts is ending. With the exception of the Lebensraum, German reproductive rates have been edging down for 16 decades and are now far past terminal. The nearly childless German baby boomer generation enters mass retirement in the 2020s, cursing contemporary Germany with a collapse in productive capacity, a collapse in tax receipts, a collapse in consumption, and an explosion of state outlays for pensions and health care. As soon as 2030, the young generation entering the workforce will be less than half the size of the boomer generation retiring. In any normal country, this would spell economic and social failure. Such ruin assumes that economic trends in Germany are positive. The quest for efficiency and quality, so central to German identity, comes at a cost. All those local and regional German governments try to capture private savings to fund community goals, leaving little in the way of financial resources for the development of a consumption-centric culture. Pair high production with low consumption, and the only option is to export the difference. Late 1800s Imperial Germany was able to absorb its output because then, like 1990s China, Germany was industrializing. But by 1900, over half the population had moved off the farm, making it the world's first majority urbanized country. An achievement, yes, but there was nowhere else for its production to go, except abroad. The mix of overproduction and subsequent imperial trade barriers ensured a litany of recessions, price crashes, and general economic dislocation. European interstate competition, already political, became deeply economic as well. It was only a matter of time until it became strategic. The first of those strategic competitions, World War I, ended with German defeat and kicked off the Great Depression, which struck nowhere worse than where it started, in Germany. Americana tells tales of Depression-era city folk returning to the farms to work the land during the Depression's deepest years. Not so in Germany, where the majority of Germans had been living in cities for decades. The only thing the Germans could do to keep costs down was to not have children. Germany's post-Cold War unification was a phenomenal national achievement, but that doesn't mean there were no side effects. The new national government decreed that the value of the former West and East German currencies would be broadly equalized, despite the East's far less advanced industrial plans. The valuation decision aimed to preserve the personal savings of the former East Germans, a political necessity in savings-driven Germany, but it has gutted the competitiveness of the East German economy ever since. Not only did this haunt the Germans with echoes of the sort of dislocation and unemployment they experienced during the Great Depression, but family formation, and from it, birth rates in the former East, crashed and never recovered. There is never a good time to have a terminal demography, but contemporary European economic trends argue for now being among the worst. A rapidly shrinking working-age population, paying a higher tax rate to support an ever larger retiree population, means Germany's already weak ability to absorb its own production weakens further. It is more important than ever for the Germans to have a place to send their wares. Germany's biggest exports by value are automotive, with 80% of the cars Germans manufacture at home being sold outside of Germany. The European Union is no longer that place. While few countries have as poor a demographic structure as Germany, most of those in the running are also within the European Union. The rest of Europe has aged beyond being able to serve Germany as an export sink. Europe isn't economically capable of filling that role, even if its demographics were healthy. At least some portion of the continent has been in recession at any given time between 2007 and 2020. Because the Germans provided the largest chunk of the financial assistance required to bail out the EU's failing members, but Berlin conditioned that support on budget cuts. Europe's weaker countries are Europe's weaker countries because they lack Germany's sublime economic geography. The state spending of these weaker states is part of what helped those weaker states close the gap with the Germans. German-imposed austerity gutted growth potential, and from it, Europe's capacity to absorb German products. Northern Europe, with all its flats and seas, is a rough-and-tumble region, with everyone in everyone else's face all the time. Germans, right in the middle of it all, have little choice but to treat military issues the same way they treat everything else, by being better. Germany's very strength invites panicked challenge. The rise and fall of Germany is European history. The only way the Europeans have ever discovered to prevent this never-ending cycle of wars is to change the game, to bring in an external security guarantor who forces everyone to be on the same side. In Europe, the institution that operationalizes the American-led order is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The NATO alliance shoehorned all European militaries, Germany included, into a single command and logistical structure under American strategic and operational authority. NATO's twin goals were to force an internal Western European peace while also securing Western Europe against Soviet aggression. As Hastings Ismay, NATO's first Secretary General, so famously put it, the alliance's raison d'etre was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. With the Cold War's end, Germany entered the best of all possible worlds. NATO expanded into the former Soviet Empire, surrounding Germany with allies. Germany's military ceased being relevant, largely because it ceased existing. Repeated, past-the-bone budget gougings functionally eliminated all German air, naval, and armored deployment capacity. For all intents and purposes, Germany no longer has a military. From 1990 until 2020, this has been fine. After all, Germany didn't face major security threats. And so the spotlight shifted from NATO to the parallel European institution formed by the Europeans themselves, the European Union. Unlike NATO, which benefits from a very large and in-charge leader and a crystal-clear founding goal, the EU tends to muddle through. Is it an economic union? A financial union? A political union? A counterweight to the United States? A free trade zone? As of early 2020, the EU has 27 members. The British left the EU in 2019, and if you ask the EU's collective leadership any of these questions, you will get at least a half dozen different answers. And that's before getting down to the nitty-gritty details of bank bailouts, or debt levels, or negotiating authority, or political norms, or voting parameters. Even relatively mild disputes require the heads of state hashing out the details during multiple all-night summits. The really big issues, such as how to address a sovereign debt crisis or undocumented migration, occupy all leadership bandwidth for a decade or more. There's also the not-so-minor issue of who's in charge. Formally, the EU presidency rotates among all the members for 6-month terms. Under the order, this slowly, softly, oddly ambling path to integration was fine. The Americans did all the heavy lifting on the security front via NATO, on the global front via their Navy, on the energy front via their position in the Persian Gulf, on the raw materials front via their primacy in the Western Hemisphere and their alliance with Australia, and on the trade front via the World Trade Organization, as well as keeping all of Europe lined up on the same side. Europe could afford to have knockdown, drag-out, multi-day arguments with itself over cheese policy. That's not a joke. For the Germans, all this dysfunction is part of contemporary Europe's beauty. NATO bars security competition among the European powers. No matter how messy or awkward or myopic the EU might become, keeping the field of competition purely economic enables Germany to be physically intact and industrially dynamic. For Berlin, that's what matters. That's all that matters. With wealth rising, stability assured, and the Germans quiescent, many Europeans have come to believe in a heady dream that after centuries of living in the world's most blood-soaked lands, they had finally achieved a sort of historical escape velocity. It's a beautiful dream. I want to believe it too. But with the American abdication of responsibility, that dream dies. Europe is a region of military pygmies who face pressing military challenges. A region suffering demographic implosion, unable to absorb immigrants. A region peppered with xenophobes who cannot control their borders. A region rumbling with environmentalists who cannot generate green power. A region facing a banking crisis that lacks the means of even defining the problem, much less rectifying it. A region that has largely outsourced its relationships with its nearest neighbors of significance, Turkey and Russia, to the departing Americans. A region whose most coherent economic, financial, and military power, the United Kingdom, has left. Europe now faces simultaneous, interlocking crises: currency, finance, banking, monetary policy, supply chains, inequality, migration, oil, natural gas, electricity, Demographics: consumption, exports, imports, Libya, Syria, Turkey, Russia. Any response requires that all European states agree on how to prioritize and address each problem. Which means for the Germans, the worst of all worlds is about to arrive. Germany is not a sunny or windy country. Despite spending nearly €2 trillion on alternate energy infrastructure and setting up omnipresent regulatory structures to favor the green tech sector, which have doubled power prices from 2000 levels, which were already more than double average U.S. prices, Germany receives less than 10% of its electricity needs from green power. Germany is more dependent upon fuel imports now than before it started its green surge. Half of Germany's exports and all its energy imports rely on access to countries beyond the EU. The United States is Germany's largest end market, while China ranks third. Nearly all of Germany's manufacturing supply chains rely upon access to countries within the EU. Germany's and Europe's demographic collapse deepens both the consumption and the production problems. With the Americans' departure, security competition is back on the table. As in China, German economic growth has been nothing shy of fantastic. As in China, German economic growth has been possible only due to the changed local security environment and risk-free trade links to the wider world that the order provided. Like China, Germany will suffer hugely from the order's end. Germany is now returning to the same rise and fall cycle that has so defined its history. The Germans are left with starkly limited choices. The North Sea has oil and natural gas, but other countries in the sea's basin, most notably the United Kingdom, already absorb most of what is available via pre-existing infrastructure. The sea's resources are unavailable to Germany. The Middle East has plenty to go around, but that region is on the wrong side of the European continent and Turkey. In a world of unsafe shipping lanes, Germany might as well be on another planet. Labor options are similarly limited. Within Europe, the Scandinavians, British, and French all operate at similar cost structures, so there are few options for operational synergies. Many European countries keep most of their manufacturing supply chains in-house for reasons geographic: the United Kingdom, Sweden, or mercantile, France, Spain. Sometimes it is simply an issue of style. Italy operates differently. Instead of the German approach of assembly lines and mass production, the Italians treat industry more like art, one at a time, handmade outputs. When the Italians handcraft a car, it's a Ferrari. When they mass produce, it's a Fiat. The largest consumption bases locally are the French and British. Even at the height of the order, the French like to keep their market to themselves. The United Kingdom was more open, but in the aftermath of the Brexit drama, count on access to the British market flat out ending. The Dutch will continue to do business with Germany, but the Netherlands is more a flow-through economy than a large final destination. The 17 million Dutch can absorb only so much. But looking east, the Germans see opportunity. The former Soviet satellites of Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary are not only near, but geographic barriers between them and the Germans are minimal. If long-haul energy imports are not an option, Russia is brimming with, relatively, short-haul delivery options, much of which flows via pipes that are already in place. Labor costs in the Central European states are 1/3 or even less of those in Germany. Integrating manufacturing systems with them not only makes economic sense, but also provides economies of scale the Germans could never achieve on their own. Poland and its Central European cohorts may be only about one-half as wealthy as Germany, but there are nearly as many people in those countries as there are Germans in Germany. They provide both manufacturing labor and a consumption base. Just beyond the Central European zone are 44 million Ukrainians and 140-ish million Russians who have proven unable to meet their own manufacture needs in any era. What's left that is worth having fits Germany's needs, and yet remains within reach isn't to the west, but to the east, putting the Germans and the Russians on a collision course. German success puts an integrated German manufacturing system in territory directly adjacent to lands the Russians see as their critical security zone. No more buffer zone. In a post-order world, everyone starts to get agitated again, with German manufacturing becoming a bit less Volkswagen-y and a bit more Panzer-y. And since the Germans will be rearming from a nearly disarmed start, The pace of defense improvement will prove terrifying to anyone who has ever crossed swords, bayonets, or artillery with the Germans in the past. On the flip side, Russian success puts Russian occupational forces within a 4-hour drive of Berlin on a light traffic day. So, where does that take us? One last dance. Germany's core issues of materials and export access are not new. Neither are Russia's concerns with frontiers and internal rebellions. Nor is it the first time the two countries have found themselves in a mutually antagonistic overlap. Historically, when such things happen, the leaders of both countries tend to take deep breaths and have a thorough conversation about the lands between them. They then proceed to draw lines around topics and on maps with the intention of avoiding a bloodbath. The problem is always the same. Divvying up influence over the territories between them is the easy part. Once any agreement is executed, however, the buffer zone between them vanishes, swallowed up by the two powers. Direct borders mean direct competitions. Every time the Germans and Russians reach this point, they eventually end up shooting at each other. The only question is, how long does the honeymoon last? A generation? A decade? Less? The last time the pact held for only 22 months. This time around, 4 issues argue for, at most, a brief period of coexistence. First, military technologies are evolving again. The last Russo-German war started with artillery and planes. Now there are cruise missiles and jets. As a rule, increases in speed and reach and lethality compress timeframes. Second, change is not simply coming to Germany and Russia's neighborhoods, but to Germany and Russia themselves. Surviving the coming global breakdown will spawn political, social, and economic revolutions in both countries. The last time these two peoples experienced such rapidly shifting fortunes, the results included Nazism and Leninism. The point is less that we'll see a return to fascism in Germany and fascism with a different name in Russia, but instead that the pressures that generated the last, harshly negative government overhaul in both countries are very similar to those of today. For example, consider what drove the fascist rise during the Weimar period of 1930s Germany. Massive dislocation of labor due to new industrial techniques that limited the need for manpower, massive economic dislocations due to disrupted export markets, massive economic inequality, massive population and migration imbalances, and political leaders who weren't so much tone-deaf as trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The Weimar system ultimately found itself overthrown by populists, who were far from shy about lurching Germany in a dangerous new direction. Any of that sound familiar? If the Americans are not managing Europe and seeing to the continent's economic and security needs, then Germany must act like a normal country again. Whatever form the Fifth Reich takes, it cannot possibly be as pacifist and deferential as the Fourth. For Russia, the possibility of a sharp systematic turnover looms even larger. Fewer than 200 people remain in Russia's intelligence officials-dominated political elite. Russia is now firmly in the zone where a single plane crash or assassination campaign or bad flu season could trigger a government breakdown or coup. The third argument for a quick slide into confrontation has to do with the limited time remaining for the countries themselves. Both countries suffer from demographic weakness so extreme as to be a country-killing issue all by itself. The time horizon is so short that most Germans and Russians alive today will live to see the end. That end might come sooner than even the country's abysmal demographic profile suggests, because not all revolutions succeed. When a political, economic, or cultural system experiences violent overhaul, there is typically a multi-year period of reset, while the old system is being wiped away, but the new system hasn't fully replaced it. The last time that happened in Germany, it involved the World War II defeat. The last time for Russia, the post-Cold War breakdown. In each case, simply finding the floor took at least half a decade. A failed political, social, and economic transformation now would likely gobble up so much of what little time Germany or Russia have remaining that they never recover. And that's before one considers the bilateral competition. What might a successful Russia do to take advantage of a failed Germany, or vice versa? A German failure to secure an economic orbit, or a Russian failure to secure better borders, really does mean the end this time around. The all-or-nothing nature of this competition intensifies pressures, raises stakes, and, again, compresses timeframes. Both countries are quite literally raging against the dying of the light. Which brings us to the fourth and final reason this is a struggle unlikely to end in a calm co-dominion over Central and Eastern Europe. Germany and Russia are not the only fish in the pond. At the top of the list of states of concern must be the United States. It isn't that the Americans are likely to see anything that overly bothers them in the intensifying German-Russian collaboration confrontation directly, but instead that actions by either Berlin or Moscow may inadvertently rub Washington the wrong way and prompt American action. A world in which American interests in Europe are not grounded in NATO, and the order is one in which American involvement is far more likely to be corporate. Because Germany's primary motivation is to secure an economic sphere of influence, the Americans and Germans could well find themselves tangling over this or that market or resource flow. A failure in Berlin to manage such entanglement effectively could sever what few connections to the wider world Germany would have otherwise managed to maintain. The Americans can easily operate beyond Europe, while Germany cannot at all. A falling out between Washington and Moscow would likely have a more visceral outcome. The United States defense and intelligence community has decades of experience in countering all things Russian. That experience, and the information and weapon systems that go with it, can easily be shared.
Civil stability doesn't matter until the day that it does. The only way that a Russian government changes course is when it collapses. I don't see us being there yet. Doesn't mean we won't reach that point. And Putin has gutted the Russian elite over the last 25 years. There are probably only about 110, 120 people left with any sort of authority. And most of them are over 55. So we are looking at the final age of the Russian government, but that doesn't mean it's going to collapse on Friday.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're catching up with the geopolitical analyst, Peter Zeihan. Peter is a best-selling author whose most recent book is The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Globalization. Peter, good to speak to you. Last time we met, it was for our special marking the anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let's start then with this Tucker Carlson interview, the interview with President Putin. How I know I don't really want to give him much publicity, but how much has it been noticed or talked about in the US?
You're having the normal people who have decided that despite Tucker being fired from every job he's ever been, and despite his legal defense here in the United States being that he's not a journalist, so he doesn't have to say anything that's accurate. In fact, his legal defense is I am allowed to lie, I'm encouraged to lie on television because I'm a propagandist. The people who think he's still great are talking about him, and everyone else has basically ignored it. And that's really the end of the story here.
Yeah, and the former head of MI6, Britain's Secret Intelligence Service here in the UK, Sir Alex Younger, he was on the radio just in the aftermath of this and said it was unforgivably boring. Did it actually achieve anything?
It achieves some clarity. We've always known that on this side of the pond that Tucker Carlson has been a Russian shill for a few years. But between not just his interview, but what he has done since the interview, he is now going out and doing Soviet-style propaganda pieces in Russia, talking about how glorious Russian life is in Moscow under sanctions. And this is the sort of things that you would have seen in the Soviet Union in the 1950s or the 1970s. And for him to have fallen so far so fast, I mean, it's a little embarrassing for him. But it gives you an idea that the Russians really are having some issues working some of their assets in the West. I'm not suggesting that the propaganda effort has not made gains, but they really have to go to kind of a lower tier of viewer if they're going to get any traction.
Let's talk about Donald Trump now for a moment, making shockwaves with his comments about NATO, effectively encouraging President Putin to attack alliance members who failed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Has that been reported much in the US?
Oh, yes, that is loud.
And what has the reaction been exactly?
A kind of horror from the point of view of folks in the center, which I think is not entirely honest, if we're going to speak candidly here. One of the problems that people in the rest of the world, especially in Europe, have kind of forgotten is that the amount of time that most NATO countries had just kind of treated the alliance as a side piece really did erode confidence in the Americans and what the Europeans would do when the rubber would hit the road. And while I am certainly a strong supporter of the alliance, especially now because of the Ukraine war, and I've definitely seen a lot of the allies step up, unless there's a significant increase in European commitment and willing to get blood in the game, what Trump said may have been a little vainglorious, but that is the future. For NATO to function, it needs to be more than an American alliance. And in my first book, The Accidental Superpower, I talk about how the Americans are losing confidence in the alliance because of this issue. Now, if it had been anyone but Trump who would have said it, it would have probably triggered a lot more soul searching because Trump goes for things for the public pizzazz. But the issue is a very, very real one. And treating this as just a Trump issue, I think, isn't going to do anyone any good.
But if he does in fact become the next US president, what influence do you think he will have over the future of NATO? What do you think actions he might take?
Trump made it very clear, unofficially, in the last 6 months of his first term, that if he was reelected on his first day, he would pull the United States out of NATO. Now, I don't think Trump personally has much of a chance of winning the second round, and that assuming he's not in prison. But if he were to win, yes, NATO would lose the United States.
So let's talk about funding for Ukraine, because after weeks of setbacks, the US Senate has finally given its approval for the $60 billion aid package as part of an overall $95 billion wartime aid package. It still has to get through the House of Representatives, though. How much focus is President Biden in his administration paying to Ukraine at the moment, do you think?
The problem with the United States political system when it comes to foreign policy is we're really only able to function and focus on one issue at a time. There's really only three people in the American political system who have a role in terms of policy making for foreign policy. You've got the National Security Advisor, the President himself, and the Federal Reserve Chief. And they just can't deal with multiple crises. There's not enough bandwidth. So because we now have Iran and the Gaza war happening at the same time, and because the Chinese degradation has accelerated, the Ukraine war by default has taken a back seat. It's not that it's not a priority, it's just that it's not the priority anymore. And without authorization from Congress, there's only so much the administration can do in terms of assistance. Now, what we're probably going to see in the House is you'll get an effort for what's called a disclosure petition, which will force a vote even if the Speaker doesn't want to bring the bill to the floor. But that's going to take at least another month. And what that will mean is that the moderate Republicans who are already getting hammered by the hard right will basically be labeled as Republicans in name only again, because they will have to support this with centrist Democrats to get this through. I have no doubt that some version of that will happen, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen this month. We're probably not going to see new aid for Ukraine until April.
And what effect do you think that will have on Ukraine?
Well, anything that's going to get ammo in their artillery tubes is going to be what they need. What we've seen in battles like Avdiivka is that the Ukrainians have gone from almost artillery parity, which has allowed them to inflict 8-1 to 10-1 casualty ratios on the Russians, to something much more closer to parity because they can't fire artillery at all. They've been relying on these little 2-pound drones that they've been mass producing, and that's great, but those drones only have a range of a couple of miles, sorry, Britain, about 3 kilometers, versus the artillery, which has a range closer to 40 kilometers.
Just to go back to that, so you are confident then that this aid package will actually be agreed then, but they'll have to wait till April, is that right?
Right. We have to basically do an end run around a faction in Congress. Sorry. This is kind of a treat for me as an American, because we've had to follow the ins and outs of your parliament's procedures for the last 7 years. Now you get to do it for us. Okay. So the way the American system works is if you want to get a majority in the House of Representatives, it's not a majority of the votes. It's a majority of the seats. And we have a number of vacancies. So for the Republicans to get something through, they need every single vote minus one. If they lose more than one of their members, they can't get anything through. So you've got this cluster of about a dozen people out of the 300 Republicans who are in the chamber who are willing to block everything, not Ukraine, They're not blocking Ukraine. They're blocking everything. And so this has now been the least productive Congress we have ever had in our country's history. And doing an end run around the American Republican manager of the House, the Speaker, is not something that is done lightly, because it usually means that the Speaker gets kicked out within a few weeks. And we are already on our fifth for this Congress. So deciding to pull that legislative trick means that we basically commit to the House of Representatives falling apart again. So they want to be very careful when they decide to go for this petition that this is the issue that they really want to die on.
And when you get moves by the UK's Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, making this direct appeal, as he did to Republicans in the US, to not show the weakness displayed against Hitler in the 1930s, and you have Grant Shapps saying the world's dictators are watching, does that actually have any traction in the US at all?
It does, not with the 12 people who are boycotting action, but it does with the mainline Republicans who realize what is at stake in Ukraine.
Okay, that's good to know. Ukraine's military intelligence has this week confirmed that it has sunk a Russian Navy landing ship close to the Russian-controlled Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. How important is it at this moment for Ukraine to demonstrate it can still take the fight to the Russians?
I don't think it's so much of a public relations issue. I think it's just an evolution of the weapons issue. One of the things that we've seen over the course of the last 18 months is the Ukrainian drone industry has really come into its own. It's holding the line at Avdiivka in a way that we didn't think was possible. And the ship that was sunk with a fundamentally new drone, which was basically a modified jet ski, something that was not in their arsenal 6 weeks ago. So the Ukrainians aren't just showing that they can hit at longer and longer ranges, but it's with more and more novel weapon systems. I think the weapon systems to watch for the most, the ones where we're going to be seeing the greatest impact on the Russians, aren't naval, though. They're these long-range air drones that are now striking chemical and energy facilities across the length and the breadth of the Russian coastline, which should be the part of the Russian system that has the best air defense. Western sanctions have had an impact on Russian energy exports, but not nearly as dramatic as what the Ukrainians have done by hitting a few fuel depots and fractionating columns.
And these parts of the campaign that you describe, it comes after a major shake-up of the Ukrainian armed forces, with the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief, General Valery Zaluzhny, replaced by General Alexander Syrsky, and 4 new other appointments in the military. What is President Zelensky trying to achieve exactly?
This is something that is a little concerning, not because I think he's made a horrible mistake or anything, but anytime you see political instability in the midst of a war, you have to be a little concerned. The outgoing folks were fairly competent and fairly politically popular. The new ones are relatively untested. But I don't want to overstate this. Whenever you have a lot of changes in tactics and strategy, especially with the dynamism of the circumstances among the allies, you're going to want to have different people in different positions regularly. The question is, what does that do to the morale of the troops? And because we've had basically the same 2 divisions fighting the Russians nonstop for 14 months now, the morale of those people is everything. So we're going to know very, very quickly whether this is going to have a positive or negative impact or otherwise. In terms of the implications for democracy, I don't see any, because these are appointed military positions. These are not civilian administrators. I wouldn't be worried at all about Zelensky and democracy until and unless they decide to not have elections. And then that's a very different conversation.
You mentioned morale. This General Syrsky, he apparently, from what I understand, is not popular with the troops. His nickname is the Butcher because of his reputation for his lack of concern for their welfare. He is trying to change that because he's been sort of promoting a kind of image of being more caring as a military leader. It's extremely important given the pressing need to recruit more troops.
No, that's absolutely the concern. And the tactics that he has expressed in the past are wildly appropriate to the front of today, but that doesn't mean that they would be inappropriate to the front of tomorrow. So the question is whether he is capable of changing tactics and operational strategy based on circumstances. We will know very soon. And if the answer is no, then he will not be there very long.
He's just visited the front line in the east of the country with Ukraine's defense minister and described the situation as precarious. What challenges does he face?
Without the ammo that is necessary to hold back the Russians in multiple places, the Ukrainians have really had to ration what they have and focus on these drone assaults. The strength of the Ukrainian system militarily is that they've really devolved a lot of decision making to the local level, but the local level can only do so much if they have limited ammo. So if we don't see a change in the military supplies soon, that local authority will evolve very, very quickly into a mass rout. Because as soon as one group decides to pull out because they can't shoot back, there's no reason then to expect the others to stick around. That's the trick here. And I'm not sure that Sersky has an answer for that. But I am not a tactical guy and I am not on the front. But that is why this is all precarious. Now, luckily, the Ukrainians have spent the last 6 months doing a bit of a shadow of what the Russians have done for the last 18 months and building up a series of minefields behind their positions to retard any sort of rapid advance. So I don't think we'd be looking at a collapse of the front, but we could see a lot more movement than we've seen in the last year.
And one of the challenges that General Sersky is facing is the reform of the Ukrainian army, and Zelensky wants a plan. What needs to be done, and how does its command and control structure stack up against what the Russians are doing and how they've changed as we go into the third year?
That's a good example of where Zersky might actually be the right guy for the job. So he has his background a little bit more rooted in the Soviet system of top-down control, and to this point that would not have worked for the Ukrainians. That local control, the local decision-making, the local innovations is what has allowed the Ukrainians to do well in the face of just massive odds. And against them has been a top-down control from the Russian system, which has wildly underperformed. But we're not in the first year of the war anymore. And as we enter year 3, what we're discovering is the lack of top-down control in Ukraine has prevented the lessons from each individual unit from coming up to the top, being turned into a broader strategy, and then percolating down to everyone. On the opposite side, on the Russian side, every once in a while, a lesson does come up through the top against all odds and penetrates the generals' heads at the very, very top. And they're like, yeah, that actually works. Let's have everyone do that. It's slow, it's painful, it's inefficient, but it means incrementally the Russians are getting better. And when they get better, everyone gets better. So the balance between the two has started to flip. And the Ukrainians are going to have to figure out how to translate local successes into a broader strategic approach. And that is the new guy's primary job. If he can pull that off, you combine Russian top-down coordination with local innovation, then we're in a different game.
And you know, people watching the war quite closely have been saying that the actions and how much he commits to defending Avdiivka will be very key, because he is the man who at all costs defended Bakhmut, and we know what happened there. And what do you think line he will take on Avdiivka, and how important is that as symbolic of the way he's going to operate as a military leader?
That's a great comparison, and I'm not sure it really paints him in the best, well, it doesn't paint him in the best light, but I'm not sure it's entirely fair. So in the defense of Bakhmut, keep in mind that the casualty ratios from the Russians to the Ukrainians was 7-1. So we can easily say that, he should have ordered a pullout earlier and to try to avoid some Ukrainian casualties. But we are at the moment in a war of attrition. And as long as we're in a war of attrition, those are exactly the sorts of numbers that the Ukrainians need. Anything less than that, honestly, is a loss for them, because the demographic overhang of the Russians versus the Ukrainians is so huge. So far at Avdiivka, we're probably looking at an even higher number, probably 8-1 to 10-1. That's exactly the position we need to be. As long as the Ukrainians are trapped in a battle of attrition, this is what has to happen. The ideal is that the Ukrainians will be able to turn this into a battle of movement. But in order to do that, they have to be able to break through the lines in the first place. And at the moment, they do not have the gear to do that.
In a recent interview, the Russian ambassador to London, Andrei Kelin, said that Russia cannot be beaten, bragging its resources are enormous. I know he would say this, but it has lost more than 3,000 tanks, according to a London-based think tank, since the start of the full-scale invasion. Is there no price too high for Russia?
No, there is not. From the Russian point of view, unless they can achieve something similar to their old Soviet perimeter, their country's indefensible. And they're right. The Russian Federation on its own has 8,000 kilometers of exposed borders. But if they can advance through Ukraine into Romania, Poland, and the Balts, that shrinks from 8,000 down to about 800. And with their less competent military, that is something that they can plug. They're not necessarily fighting this war for this war. They're fighting this war in order to achieve a securable perimeter for when their demographics fall apart over the course of the next 20 years. It's not a stupid plan. And that means that the Russians will not stop until they reach there, or they're forced to stop. In terms of the hardware they have, yes, they've lost 3,000 tanks. That's probably the sum total of their entire pre-war operational inventory. But they have at least another 9,000 that they can refurbish in addition to anything they can bring online. So they can maintain this pace for at least another 8 to 10 years. And then there's also the manpower issue. Yes, they've lost dead and wounded probably close to 500,000 so far, but they have another 7 to 8 million men in their 20s that haven't fled yet. So again, 8 to 10 years is how long they can keep this up, and they will keep it up until they can't.
Yeah, I mean, the Russian public is paying a high price for this war.
Yes.
We have an election coming up in Russia. We know what the conclusion will be. But how important is it that in that election, President Putin is at least seen to be winning comfortably and have the support of it? Because the ordinary person, the electricity is going off. They're having all kinds of problems outside the big cities. So it could be a precarious time, could it not, for President Putin?
To be perfectly blunt, you Brits have been duking it out with the Russians a lot longer than us Americans. You know how high their tolerance for pain is. Civil stability doesn't matter until the day that it does. The only way that a Russian government changes course is when it collapses. I don't see us being there yet. Doesn't mean we won't reach that point. And Putin has gutted the Russian elite over the last 25 years. There are probably only about 110, 120 people left with any sort of authority. And most of them are over 55. So we are looking at the final age of the Russian government, but that doesn't mean it's going to collapse on Friday.
You previously, in this interview, you said that the US lacks the bandwidth or was that effect to deal with more than one foreign policy crisis at a time. What do you think the consequences might be of that for Europe at this time?
Well, the French keep saying that they want European sovereignty when it comes to defense issues. There's an opportunity here, but there's really not a lot that the Europeans can do in the short term, short being in the next several weeks, in order to change the American conversation here. What is required is a deep commitment to defense in the light of the idea that the Russians are coming for Warsaw and nukes are part of the conversation now. It's not just on the fringes. Now we're seeing movement out of Germany. Just in the last week, they've announced that they're basically increasing their defense spending by almost a third, and at a single leap have managed to get back up over that 2% threshold that they've been avoiding for so long. That's a great step. You're a Brit. Of course, you can imagine what the German procurement system looks like when they decide to do that. That needs to happen in another dozen countries in Western Europe, not in Central Europe. The Central Europeans have already done that. The only way you're going to change the conversation of the United States if you make it numerically obvious that the situation has changed. Now, we have seen that to a degree with European funding for Ukraine. The Europeans have massively stepped up in the last year and have now providing significantly more aid than the Americans, even before the Americans had this congressional problem. But in terms of policy, the coordinating function of Europe in NATO versus the United States and NATO just broadly doesn't exist. And that's got to change.
And in terms, you mentioned Germany, might it actually not be such a bad thing that the US forces Europe to get more serious about its own defence right now? And also referring back to the kind of things that potential President Trump had said. This week, the boss of Germany's Rheinmetall, its biggest defence firm, told the BBC that ammunition stocks are currently empty and that Europe will need 10 years before it can be fully ready to defend itself, which is quite a frightening comment to make.
Well, from an American point of view who views himself as a bit of a historian, I see both. I both don't take this very seriously, and I'm very scared of where it might lead. The Germans have proven in times past, when they feel the need, that they can turn around their entire military industrial complex in a matter of months. And if the funding is now there, then it's just an issue of building the industrial plant, and that is something the Germans do better than anyone else in the world, including the Chinese. So, if the decision has been made, Germany is back in the game as a major military industrial player. In the case of the Ukraine war,